Welcome to part two of the age of progressive reform. Now we're going to look at the good government movement. Now, progressive ideas like Hull House was designed to tackle that first target of these progressives, and that was urban reform, right? Reformers like Frederick C. Howell said that the challenge of the city has become one of decent human existence, right? What happens here is you have these progressive reformers who, remember, are middle class and upper class that walk through and see some of these downtrodden labor class areas, and they see the filth and the pollution. And you got to realize things like unclean water and disease, they don't recognize boundaries between, like, say, the working class districts and the upper class districts, right? And so they began to worry about the health of the cities, and they also began to worry about the moral fiber of the cities. When they see kids sleeping on the street like this, and they say, why are these kids not in school like our kids are? And that's a key point here. You notice that a lot of these reforms that progressives come up with are all designed to try and get this laboring class to live more like them, more like the middling classes at least, right? Which means it wasn't always appreciated by those that they were trying to help. You ask a laboring class family, hey, don't you think your kid should be in school? They're going to tell you, no, that kid needs to work. We need every member of this family to work. Otherwise, we don't eat. So then one of the questions of progressivism is, how far can this reform go, right? How far can you take things for the public interest before you begin trotting on individual rights, right? And did the progressive idea of the public good really meet everyone, or did it just meet those middle and upper class reformers? But out of this urban reform comes the idea of the good government movement, right? Major urban centers tended to be stupidly politically corrupt, right? Most major cities were run by what were called political machines, right? Lincoln Steffens, who was an investigative reporter, is actually going to document this. He is going to take a look at city governments across 6 major cities in the United States in the early 1900s, and he's going to document the deep corruption that laid at the core of these governments. And in 1904, he's going to publish his work. It's called The Shame of the Cities. Now, in this, he is not going to blame the corruption of city government on any one class, right? You'd think, it's like, who does he blame it on? Does he blame it on the rich elite, or does he blame it on the ignorant migrant workers from Eastern Europe who don't assimilate well? I mean, you could go all these different directions on whose fault of it for bad government. But when he finished his study, he realized that the people to blame wasn't any one group, it was everyone. He said, the misgovernment of the American people is misgovernment by the American people, right? In other words, you get the government that you deserve, right? If you want good government, the people have to demand good government, right? So the progressive good government movement is going to take off in every one of these major cities. Organizations like the National Municipal League are going to form to combat corruption in government, right? And they're going to have some successes. For example, progressives in New York City actually took down Tammany Hall in 1901, and for a while anyways, Tammany Hall was out of power in the city government, right? Some of this progressive reform, as far as the good government movement, though, was drawn about by tragedy. In 1900, in Galveston, Texas, there will be a massive hurricane that'll strike the city, right? Somewhere around 8,000 people will be killed. We don't have exact numbers. We can't ever have exact numbers here, right? But it is the largest single-day loss of life in the United States in its entire history, inside its borders, right? Think about it. All these other events that have happened, they haven't come close to that. The Battle of Antietam, 9/11, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yeah, lots dead, but nowhere near 8,000 people like what we have here. Now, the destruction of Galveston was so devastating from this hurricane that Galveston literally had to reinvent itself, right? Its city's departments just were not set up to handle this kind of, how do you deal with 8,000 bodies, right? I mean, initially they'd actually tried to see if they could bury them at sea, but some of them started coming back to shore, right? So they reorganized their government to create special commissions of experts and managers, city departments, where each person under an individual manager was responsible for certain aspects of the city government, right? Public safety, sanitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. right? And the city manager system was so accepted or so successful that it was adopted by all the other major cities. As a matter of fact, pretty much any town you go into now, like say for example, the Flower Mound campus is where I teach, right? The Flower Mound city government is kind of designed on, with its departmental structure, it's designed on the Galveston model. It's a progressive idea that really sunk in, and it's pretty much used by every city in the United States today, for the most part. Now, another major accomplishment of the good government movement was election reform, right? Elections varied from city to city, but in general, you had a lot of areas that were open for corruption in electioneering, right? For example, you didn't have secret ballots, right? Everybody knew who you're voting for because you were dropping your ticket into that guy's bucket, right? That means that you were very open to things like voter intimidation. You would actually have poll bullies that would try and ward you away from candidates that they didn't want you to vote for, right? So the election reforms that the progressives will end up adopting and will become part of the American political system are things like getting rid of the ward system. The idea behind this was to broaden democracy. It used to be in cities, you had the 19th Ward of Chicago, I'll use them for example. For the city council, a member of the 19th Ward will run for the council member for the 19th Ward, and only people in the 19th Ward were allowed to vote for him, right? So the idea was, wait a minute, let's adopt at-large elections. And this way, everybody gets to vote. It's a broadening of democracy. That's a good thing, right? Well, remember, like other things we'll see with progressivism, there's unintended consequences, right? What this is going to do, actually, it's actually going to really have a hugely negative effect on minority candidacies. Let's take that 19th Ward for a second. Remember that demographic I mentioned for the 19th Ward? If you were a Polish candidate running for the councilman of the 19th Ward, you probably had a pretty decent shot at that position as a Polish candidate, right? But what now if it's open citywide? What is the chance of you as a Polish immigrant becoming a member of the city council if the entire city's voting for you? It's pretty limited. So minority candidacies are going to take a big hit as a result of this. They're also going to adopt the Australian-style ballot. That's that column-style ballot that you see in most voting booths today, and the secret ballot. Okay, the secret ballot. So no longer could you have poll bullies trying to ward you away from a certain candidate's voting tin, if you will, right? But of course, this also opens up a whole new avenue of corruption, right? If it's a secret ballot, then how do you know who put what in that box? One of the most famous stories of this is what happened with Lyndon Johnson and box number 13 when he was running for the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate, right? He was behind in that election when all of a sudden a box called box number 13 showed up and gave him the votes he needed to actually win the Democratic primary there. And the interesting thing about the votes in this box is that everybody in that community that had voted there in box 13 had lined up to vote in alphabetical order, right? Had voted using the same pen, and they must have all been related because they had the same penmanship. Okay, got fraud? I mean, it opens up a whole new set of avenues, which brings one interesting point when it comes to progressivism, and I guess maybe history in general, is that you find that history is paved with the bodies of those who were killed by good intentions, right? Progressives are trying to make all these reforms, and the one thing that we see more often than not is that this progressive reform is seen as good, but then there's these unintended consequences that we see as a result of it, things that they didn't expect. The intent of creating a secret ballot was not to create a whole new avenue of corruption. The idea was to eliminate corruption, but, you know, it found a way.